So I read Game of Thrones, and I actually went into this book actively wanting not to like it. And I hate to say it, but it's actually a good book. Let me explain. So I was there for the show. I was there for all of the hype of the show. I watched the show. To be quite honest, after a couple of years and how big the show actually got, you kind of just got sick and tired of hearing people rave about it, and you're like, I wish they'd kind of just shut the fuck up about it for a little bit. I mean, it was a good show. Don't get me wrong. It was genuinely a good show. It wasn't quite as good as the world seemed to think it was, but it was a good show. I found it to be a little bit slow and a little bit boring and kind of a trudge to get through at times. I think somewhere around season 5, one of those seasons dropped, and I kind of had to go back and binge the last season before I could even watch the new one because I just legitimately fell off. So that is part of the reason why I'm like, do I really want to get into thousands of pages of books over a show that was just good, not great? Then, on top of that, you have to understand, this is a book series that will never be finished. I mean, it's just not. George R.R. Martin is an author who I am 100% convinced has absolutely no intentions of ever finishing this book series. Dude's like 90, and he keeps saying that he's writing the second to last book, which means there's another one after this one, and he's been doing that for like 100 years. And if it took that long for this book, the next one ain't coming. Anyway, it's a series that isn't going to ever be finished is what I'm saying. And then on top of that, fantasy just isn't my genre. I've never been a huge fantasy reader, as I've said recently on the channel, because this year I have gone into like 6 different fantasy series because I'm attempting to introduce it into my reading and try and really get more of it in there because I love fantasy in like movies and in video games and in TV shows. I love it everywhere. I just don't tend to read a lot of it. And to be quite honest, fantasy, as far as books is concerned, is kind of a blind spot for me as far as my experience goes. And I would like to rectify that. So anyway, add all that together, and I honestly never intended to ever read this. I just kind of, when I was going through putting that list of like all those fantasy series together that I was reading, this was one of the ones where I was like, yeah, not that one. Not going to read Game of Thrones. Fuck that. And somehow along the lines, I ended up starting all these different series, and I think it was kind of like when I started that Joe Abercrombie series up there. The First Law series that I was like, if I'm going to do grimdark and that doesn't feel grimdark, I was like, I kind of want to experience, and maybe I really should try Game of Thrones. Well, here we are. And, we'll definitely say right off the top that that's grimdark. That shit is grim as fuck. Anyway, starting with the actual review here, I would like to say that I really genuinely enjoyed this, and I genuinely enjoyed this book a whole lot more than I expected to. And to be quite honest, I enjoyed it quite a bit more than I enjoyed the show. I just feel like it felt somehow like a tighter, more streamlined story in the book, and I don't know if that's actually genuinely fair because the first season of Game of Thrones I haven't seen in a lot of years, so my recollection of that is fuzzy at best. So it felt tighter and more focused than the TV show. But then the scope and the size and the scale of it is just awe-inspiring. Every page, every turn of the page, every turn of the corner, something feels huge. The story feels big. The consequences feel big. The history feels big. I don't know how to explain. Everything feels like there's just this size that is unimaginable. When they reference history and historical events and corners of the world, and you feel like there is a genuine mass to what is being described to you. The scope is just hard to imagine how big and filled out this, and it doesn't feel hollow. It doesn't feel like lip service to something off in the distance that you'll never really experience, and you won't. I'm not going to go trudging through all the prequels, probably, but you just feel like there's so much there. There's so much history to all of these families and all of these regions and all of these cities, and it just, I don't know how to explain it. Just the size and the scope, and it's not really like a thing. You know, you don't really go into all of these actual corners of the world. It's just a feeling that you get. And just to, as an example, just let's compare it to, because I read this in between books of the First Law trilogy, and I'm not trying to shit on the First Law trilogy, but that size, scope, and scale just isn't there. It's big, and they're talking about the North and the South and the this and the that and all these different regions in First Law, but it never quite feels the same as it does in Game of Thrones. It's a very different vibe to what's happening in this book, and the feelings that you get as you're reading it. It feels so much more epic. And that was good too, don't get me wrong. I got a whole video where I gotta make going through the rest of that trilogy at some point. And spoiler alert for anyone who watched that Blade Itself video, it gets a lot better as it goes on. It's not all just mid like that book was. Anyway, back to Game of Thrones. Then on top of just that perceived scale and size that you have in this book, there's the tone. And I was hinted at it in the beginning when I said this is grim as fuck. And it is. It's this just tone of this is so dark and depressing and relentless. It is bad things start happening and they don't stop happening for however many 700 pages. It is utterly relentless. It will beat you down and you will just don't go into this in a bad mood. You won't come out of it feeling any better. You will feel worse. Like, once again, okay, sorry, First Law. But once again, in my First Law Blade Itself video, I said that felt like the tone was trying to be quirky and fun. There's nothing quirky and fun about this one. Nothing. Anyway, then there's the language. And by language, I just mean language. The language that is used in the book is just so pitch perfect, and it creates the voice of the story. And I don't know if this is a typical Martin voice for a book. I'm not necessarily, this was the first one I've ever read, but it goes together with the language, and the language and the voice go together, and it creates this harmony of an experience that you have as you go through the book. And it just sets that same mood and that tone, and it sets it all up on end, and it just adds to the experience of reading it. And that would just be the voice of the book and the language that he chose to portray it. It all goes together to make this completely seamless experience. It was quite impressive. And then there's the chapters, and I don't feel like I am going to be able to add much to this conversation, because that's one of the big things that you always hear about A Song of Ice and Fire is these are the best point of view character chapters you'll ever read. Nobody else does point of view character chapters like George R.R. Martin does, and I don't know if that is true, but boy, these are some of the best I've ever read. They really are something special. The point of views are done so well, and they lock you into a specific character and a certain perspective and a certain set of events. The way that they're structured is very well done. The order that they come in and the way it unveils the story is very well done. It's masterful, I would say. That could be a stumbling block for an author attempting to put these point of view characters together and get the reveals to happen in the order and in the way that they should. And it's done just exceptionally well here. Then it is wonderfully useful to get inside the heads of these different characters, and each different character kind of has different interactions, and they kind of flow through each other as the book goes along. And the way it shifts and kind of locks you in here, there, and everywhere as you go is amazingly helpful in getting to know the different characters and the nuances of the different characters in a book with a cast of characters this large, because it is exceptionally easy to lose track of characters and so many books that have large casts, and they'll be like, oh, and then Ralph walks up. You're like, who the fuck is Ralph? I feel like I should have a notebook over here helping me keep track. Maybe I'll create a spreadsheet in Excel just for the list of characters. And this did not have that problem. I mean, you're probably going to have a few mentions that you're like, but for the most part, it was very, very easy to keep track of. And I personally would attribute that to the way the point of view characters flowed, worked together, and really assisted me, in keeping track of all of this massive cast of characters. It was, once again, just exceptionally well done. And while we're on the subject of chapters, the chapters themselves were just very well written. They were very well structured. I did audiobook a lot of this as I was going through just my daily life, and you could be 3 sentences or more away from the end of a chapter, and just by the shift in the way that he was talking, I was like, oh, chapter's over, because, and then he would give you a couple more sentences, and he'd normally drop on some kind of a impactful line, or at least it felt like it was supposed to be impactful, like boom, there's the end of the chapter, and then the next one would start. But it was just when you're several sentences away from the end of a chapter and you're like, oh, this one's over, isn't it? Because of the structure of the chapters itself felt so well thought out and so well just delivered. I just really have to say this was extremely well written. And I am genuinely surprised at how good of a book this actually turned out to be. Not that I had any assumptions that George R.R. Martin was a bad writer. It's just, I don't know what I expected. But this was better. A lot better than what I thought it was actually going to be. And now, like I said, the show ended up feeling a little bit slow and a little bit trudgy as you went through it. And the show constantly was referring to like all this cool shit that happened in the before times. And I was constantly like, yeah, that's good, great, and fine. When's the cool shit gonna happen in the now time? And I'm not far enough into the book series yet to be able to tell if that's actually going to end up being a problem for the book series as well, like it was in the show. But as of right now, I'm thoroughly impressed, and the tone and the mood and the atmosphere has been more than enough just to keep me invested, interested, and engaged in the book itself. And I would have to give this one a very strong 8 out of 10. Anyway, everybody, as always, the link for my Patreon's in the description below. The link for my Discord's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.